Hey,
Hello.
how's it going?
Good. How are you?
I am good. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Hello, everyone.
Oh, wow. So, surprise.
It's me, Karina. It's not Jessie.
Yeah.
I am stepping in for Jessie today. She is not feeling very well, so we're praying for you, Jessie. We love you, and yeah, they asked me to host, so I am here to help Ben. So I'm excited. I feel honored to be here. It's been a while since I've been on the Bible study, so I'm excited. I'm a little nervous, not gonna lie, but I'm ready. I'm ready.
Yeah, it's been before I was part of this. So, it's
Yes.
my first time doing it with you, and I'm really excited to have you as part of this.
Thank you. I hope everyone's doing well. Just say hello in the comments.
Yes. So, we have Pastor Tanya. Hi, Pastor Tanya. Lindsay, Jesse. Oh, Tanya Marie.
Anya Marie.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, people are still coming online. I mean, hello again to everyone. Hello if you're joining us in the future and you're rewatching this video. We appreciate you as well. And we're kicking it off. Well, we're not really kicking it off. We're continuing it,
Yeah.
I suppose. We're continuing our conversations on Kings.
Yes.
This is
Yes.
Kings Part 2.
Kings Part 2. And if you guys are there, if you can share the stream, I know that we're streaming it through Facebook as well as YouTube. So if you have anyone, just send them the link and let them know, hey, Bible study's going on. Let's learn about the Bible. I have been extremely blessed, as I'm sure many people that are on here or have watched it, after the live, where, I'm so grateful that, as I mentioned, we have our beautiful church that loves the word of God and
Yeah.
that loves people, because this takes time. I was telling Ben that you know I appreciate all the Bible study teachers, because I know the time that goes into this. Like, I know Ben is not just doing this like last minute. Like, we were having conversation, and you're showing me his notes, and they're so detailed. Like, you can tell the passion, and that's how it is with every Bible study teacher. They put so much work into this, and they love the word of God, and they want us to love it as well and learn. So I'm so grateful for this, because this is a perfect tool to study. And if you don't understand, you have someone that is literally explaining it to you, breaking it down to where you can understand the Bible. And so I'm so grateful that we do this. I think you, Ben, Jesse, Pastor Ezekiel, for taking the time of doing this. And I'm sure a lot of people in the comments, if you guys appreciate our Bible study teachers, can we show some love to them on the comments and tell them thank you for the time and the effort, because I know that the time and the studying that goes into this. And so I appreciate you guys. Seriously, I really do.
Thank you. Yeah, on behalf of the rest of the team too. Thank you. Yeah. It's honestly, it's a blessing for us too, just to be part
Yes.
of it. I'm sure that Ezekiel or Jesse would agree that there's just getting to go into it and to share it, and because we love talking about it and we love to study it. So, yeah. Um, well, I guess we'll get into it.
Yeah, it's 8:09, so I guess we can go ahead and start. I'm gonna open up in prayer, and then we're gonna step into Kings Part 2. So I'm going to go ahead and open. Heavenly Father, we thank you, Lord, for this moment, God. We thank you, Lord, that we can come together, Lord, as a community, as a family, Father, that we can come together, Lord, to learn your word, God, because we know, Father, that in your word there is life, God. We know, Lord, that you are still speaking, God, and we want to understand who you are, God. We want to know who you are. And Lord, what better way, God, than to know your word, God. And so we ask you, Lord, tonight that you continue, Father, to open up our hearts and our minds to receive, God. Help us understand you more. Help us to have knowledge of you and who you are, and God. And I thank you for Ben, Lord, for doing this, God, for saying yes to you, Lord, and taking the time, God, to pour out into your people, Lord, because he truly is pouring out, God. And so I just ask you, Father, that you have your way, God, that you speak to us, that we come out of here, Lord, come out tonight learning more of you, God, and being more in love with the Bible, and to read the word of God, and to get to know you better, Lord, because we know, God, that the Bible, Lord, that your word is for us, God. And so, God, give us the hunger, God. May we learn, God, together, Lord. And we just ask you, Father, again, we invite you, God. We know, Lord, that you are in the midst of us, God. We ask you, Holy Spirit, to have your way in us. In Jesus' mighty name, amen.
Amen. All right. Well, so yeah, like we said, Kings Part 2, which is not Second Kings per se, though we will absolutely, this will be our last study on Kings for this series, and we will be going into Second Kings, but we're going to start in First Kings because we didn't actually get done with it. We just mostly talked about Solomon.
Yeah.
And if you guys remember, Solomon was David's son, and he had a interesting story. One, if you've read it by now, you probably had a lot of moments where you're like, is Solomon a good guy or is he a bad guy? And like real people, it's more complicated than that. And the portrait painted of Solomon is a mixed bag, and it doesn't always tell you exactly what it thinks of him.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I remember the Bible study or Bible project mentioning an article or a book that I would like to find eventually, but that's apparently was called "Did the Narrator Come to Praise Solomon or to Bury Him?"
Ooh.
And so it's a mixed bag. If you guys remember, he establishes his reign through somewhat violent means, and then he gets this great vision from God where he asks for wisdom, and that seems like a great thing. But then he sort of ends up building up a lot of wealth and breaking pretty much all of the laws that the kings that were specifically king laws in the in Deuteronomy, and which climaxes sort of with him turning to idol worship, which is big bad. It's like the official departure from their God, from the God of Israel, and so that's not a great situation, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely.
As with every little inch of the Bible, there's so much more that we could have gone into, but we have to get through the rest of Kings as well. What we've seen, and I think that it's really interesting that even throughout the narrative so far from Genesis, we've been waiting for this, the snake crusher, the promised snake crusher, and it almost feels like we've been trying to find it by escalating the human, because we start and we're just got patriarchs of families, but then that grows, it turns into leaders of nations with like Moses and Joshua and the judges, and then kings, and then they add on to the kings, and that climaxes with Solomon, who's just got so much power, so much wealth, so much wisdom and stability. Of if anyone was the snake, if it was a matter of more and more power and status, Solomon was it.
Yes, I agree.
He was the top of the top.
Yeah. It's like, this is him. This is who we're waiting for. This is the king.
And so what leaves off at the end of Solomon's reign is man, what if it's not that, what is it? If it's not what humans see, what humans think we need, then what is it? Yes. And you'd almost think that at this point you'd have nothing left to do but just trust Yahweh. Unfortunately, that isn't necessarily the story that the rest of Kings tells. real quick, we'll take a look at the structure of kings. We showed this in the last one, and we only covered really the first 3 sections there up to a nation divided. That's where we're going to start, and then we're going to cover the rest of this, and we're gonna skip through it quite a bit. So just be prepared for that. But as always, if you have questions, even if it's not something that I talked about, please leave them in the chat. If you have comments, leave them in the chat. Things that you've noticed that you find interesting or important, like, just please engage with us. We love to hear from you, and we'll try to answer questions or at least talk about questions. But yeah, we're going to pick up kind of where we left off. So we in fact, a little bit earlier than where we ended, because we ended where the nation had already split. Mm-hmm. But just going a little bit before that, we're going to be introduced to an important character who's named, an important character during the split who's named Ahijah. Mm-hmm. And Ahijah is what's called a prophet. And when it comes to key themes, I'm just going to give you guys the first one right here, mm-hmm. Which is the key theme that, let me re-edit that covenant. The key theme of covenant watchers. So we had the key theme of covenant breakers. Mm-hmm. Solomon breaks the covenant, and we'll see that the kings and the people continue to break the covenant. But the prophets are covenant watchers. They're going to be these characters that God uses to call them back. And we know them a lot for prophesying. Mm-hmm. But they're not just telling the future. They are warning. Yes. They're the voice of Yahweh warning them of the future if they don't come back into relationship with Yahweh. And that's ultimately what they're doing, is trying to bring them back to their God, who loves them and wants to have a covenant with them and continue to have a relationship with them, and doesn't want them to fall into the consequences of their actions. So we're going to see a lot of prophets actually come up. While this book is called Kings, it's almost like kings versus prophets. Because we'll see a lot of kings doing a lot of bad things, yes. And the prophets who essentially are constantly on behalf of Yahweh in tension with them, yes. Critiquing, ridiculing, warning, and calling them back to covenant. Mm-hmm. And this starts here with the end of Solomon's reign. So Solomon's still alive, but he has turned to idol worship. He's instituted idol worship, yes. in Israel. And this prophet shows up on the scene. Ahijah shows up on the scene actually in 1 Kings 11. And this will be verses 29 through 30. And this is where where he's going to give a prophecy, as we'll see. Karina, would you please?
Yes. And it came about at that time when Jeroboam went out of Jerusalem that the prophet Ahijah, the Shilonite, found him on the road. Now Ahijah had clothed himself with a new cloak, and both of them were alone in the field. Then Ahijah took hold of the new cloak which was on him and tore it into 12 pieces. And he said to Jeroboam,
yeah.
Jeroboam, there you go. Right. Take for yourself 10 pieces, for this is what Yahweh, the God of Israel, says. Behold, I am going to tear the kingdom away from the hand of Solomon and give you 10 tribes. But he shall have 1 tribe for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen from all the tribes of Israel. Because they have abandoned me and have worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of Moab, and Milcom, the god of the sons of Ammon, and they have not walked in my ways, doing what is right in my sight and keeping my statutes and my ordinance, as his father David did.
Yes. So this is our first well, not our first, but certainly this is a great example of a sort of a format that the prophets will take when they come to kings. Now, in this case, he's coming to a future king, which is Jeroboam. If you remember from last episode, Jeroboam will become king of Israel. So the nation's going to split after Solomon's death, and his son Rehoboam will become king of Judah, and Jeroboam's going to become the king of Israel, the northern tribes. As you're reading through Kings and as we're listening to this, remember Israel is the northern kingdom and its capital is Samaria, and Judah is the southern kingdom and its capital is Jerusalem. So, so this prophet Ahijah comes to Jeroboam, and he's prophesying like, hey, this is what's going to happen. The kingdom's going to split, and I'm going to make you king of the northern kingdom. And but why? But this isn't the end of what Ahijah says to him, and we're gonna cover that in a second. The second part, which is really important. But one thing I want us to notice here too, that I think is really important, is actually I'm gonna put it back up real quick. In verse 33, he says, because they have abandoned me and have worshipped Asheroth and list these gods, and they have not walked in my ways. So this is not simply just about Solomon, right? This isn't just Solomon did this, but the people did this. This is not the nations paying for the sins of just Solomon. It's very explicit here that everyone has taken, that it's towards everyone who has taken part in this idol worship that's sort of being held accountable here, and it's the consequences of that are going to be this split. But why is this being told to Jeroboam, and why is and why is it important that God tells him this? Well, the next part of what Ahijah says to him, just the next verses later. So this will be 1 Kings 11, actually just verse 38. You can read that.
Okay. Then it shall be that if you listen to all that I command you and walk in my ways and do what is right in my sight by keeping my statutes and my commandments, as my servant David did, then I will be with you and build you an enduring house as I built for David, and I will give Israel to you.
So that's quite the offer. It's the offer that was made to David. So this call, this warning of what's going to happen, also comes immediately with a call to relationship with Yahweh, and that's key. This isn't just being told just cause, right? He wants a relationship. Yes, it's going to split, but he doesn't want to just leave Israel out in the dust, right? He wants both of them. He wants them unified, but now they're going to split because of the turmoil that's been created, and he's calling them back into covenant relationship. And I think besides it being the first sort of this pattern that we see, it's really important for setting up that pattern, you might say, of what the role of the prophet is. He's calling him into that covenant relationship.
Yes.
And that's really the reason that he's even talking about the future in the first place, right? Just so that we can get, because I know that I used to always think, oh, that prophets, they tell the future, and that's cool.
Yes.
Right?
And it's like you said, covenant watchers. What are they telling them to do? To keep the covenant, to keep God's commandments. So it's like you said, that they're calling the people back to God. Hey, remember my covenant, remember my commandments. And so, that's a good way of putting it, because I saw it the same way as you before. Like, they're just there to tell the future,
Right.
But it's actually beautiful to see that, that was their role, is to bring them back. Yes, they're telling you about the future, but they're letting you know, come back to God, come back to his commandments, come back to his ways. Because you said they were worshiping idols. Right there.
Yeah, it's the breaking of the biggest laws and many laws. So,
Yes.
and leads them into the breaking of more. Um, I think that the Bible, the authors, because they're already immersed in this time period, take for granted what it means to be worshiping other gods. Something that we maybe don't just understand about what that means when it comes to what are the practices associated with that.
Yes.
And we'll even see that there's points here where there's child sacrifice, just to name one big bad of what the customs of following these other deities would have been.
Yes. Yes.
So it's not just the fact that they're betraying Yahweh and breaking a covenant that they made with him, a covenant which had terms to it, but then that leads them into committing evil against themselves and against their brothers and sisters and against other nations when they're supposed to be a blessing to the nations and set apart from the nations, and they're already going to begin to act like the other nations. In fact, Jeroboam, unfortunately, does not take God up on this offer. He builds 2 golden calves once he becomes king, which is essentially just, you remember that terrible thing that they did back at Sinai? He did it twice. It's just even worse.
Oh my goodness. Not just 1, but 2. He did 2.
Yes. And just like they did at Mount Sinai, he says, these are your gods, Israel, that brought you out of Egypt. He's conflating them now with Yahweh, which is to also reduce the name, right? That somehow to suggest that Yahweh is this golden statue of a cow is an insult.
Yes, that they made
with their own hands.
Yes,
right. And it's not just, and besides the insult to them, it's an insult to themselves because Yahweh has an image. It's them. We learned that from Genesis, right?
Yes.
So it's an insult to themselves too. So yeah, it's that's just a little bit of just the underlying problem surrounding idol worship. Now we're going to jump right ahead a few kings to King Ahab, because, and a lot of you guys might have heard that name, King Ahab, and his wife Jezebel. That name came up even just in the sermon that was given this last Sunday from Pastor Sarai. So Ahab and his wife Jezebel are notable figures in Kings, and it spends actually a lot of time on Ahab's reign. It has to do a lot with Ahab and Jezebel, and also the prophet, who's, like I said, this is very kings versus prophets, Elijah. And that's also a name you've probably heard before. Yes. So these are names. These are big characters. And they have their own legacy that travels through even into the New Testament when it comes to the use of their names and what it means. Now, just to get an idea of Ahab, the introduction so if you're reading through Kings, quick aside, if you're reading through Kings, you'll find that every time a new king is introduced, it follows a format. It'll say the king's name, who their father was, the year of the king of the opposite kingdom that they began to reign in, which can be a confusing way of keeping time, but it's all they have for this book. And how long they reigned, how old they were, and then it gives them a rating. The narrator essentially gives them a rating, is how you can think of it. And that rating is based on, did they keep the covenant with Yahweh? Did they remove idol worship? Did they please him, or did they just do what was evil in his sight? When you're reading, all of the northern kingdoms get a bad rating from the narrator, that they did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And most of those of the southern kingdom do as well, but there's a few good ones out there, and we'll talk about a couple of them. But with that in mind, I think Ahab's introduction kind of tells us all we need. It does a better introduction than I can myself. So We'll read this. This is going to be in 1 Kings chapter 16, starting at verse 29.
Okay. And it says, now Ahab, the son of Omri, became king over Israel in the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah. And Ahab, the son of Omri, reigned over Israel and Samaria for 22 years. Ahab, the son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him. Verse 31, and as though it had been a trivial thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, he married Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians,
Yeah,
and
Sidonia.
went and served Baal and worshipped him. So he erected an altar for Baal at the house of Baal, which he built in Samaria. Ahab also made the Asherah. So Ahab did more to provoke the Lord God of Israel to anger than all the kings of Israel who were before him. Wow.
So yeah, that's a pretty heavy introduction for
Yes.
a king. He was the worst one so far, which is crazy because that's what they said of his father too.
Wow.
So his father was the worst one so far, and now he's come, and now he's the worst one so far. So, and it's all right. The idol worship, which leads to everything else, right?
Yes.
So, we get. Sorry, let me just, because I'm flipping through the Bible here. So this is also, we meet Elijah. So one of the things that happens almost immediately is that Ahab's doing terrible things, and so Elijah is sent to call him out of it, and as a consequence, and as sort of a proof, if you will, too, of the power and the authority, this comes with a drought. So a drought comes, and yeah, sorry, let me just make sure I'm in the right place here, because I want to. Yeah, so there's a drought that comes. A king of one of the surroundings of Aram, Ben Hadad, he comes and makes war with Ahab. He actually besieges Samaria, and it's actually really interesting because when I'm sorry. Sorry, I was getting a little ahead of myself. The first, I apologize. So there's a drought, right? And in fact, Ahab had killed as many of the prophets and priests of Yahweh as he could find.
Mm-hmm.
And Elijah's like one of the only ones that's left.
Wow.
But Elijah confronts Ahab, and he essentially he says, "Hey, meet me at the top of this mountain with all the prophets of Baal, right?" And there's like 450 of them. So Ahab agrees, and they go up, and with all the people, there's a bunch of people who come and witness this. And Elijah essentially extends a challenge, if you will, to these other prophets, and he says, let's essentially have a contest, right? You'll build an altar to your deity, to Baal, and I'll build an altar to Yahweh, and then we'll both prepare an offering. We'll kill an ox, and we'll put it on the thing that I just said, and I just forgot the word for. The altar, and then you'll pray to your gods to bring fire down and light the altar, because it would be a burnt offering. So normally they would light it, but it's like, hey, we'll let the gods light it. So you pray to your God to send fire, and I'll pray to mine, and we'll see who's really God.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And they're like, all right, that sounds like a great idea. I mean, how can they really refuse a challenge like that?
Yeah.
all the people are like, yes, we want to see this contest taken out. So he essentially says, well, you have a lot of people. You guys go first. Choose whichever ox you want, and you guys go first. And this is in the morning. And they build their altar. They sacrifice the ox, and they start doing their worship, their praying ceremony. They're dancing around their altar, and they're praying to Baal, and nothing happens. And the text tells us that at noon, Elijah starts to mock them. It's really, Elijah's very he's
spicy.
Yeah, he's very spicy. he says maybe you need to shout louder.
Oh,
maybe Baal's far away and he can't hear you, or maybe he's asleep.
Oh no!
But surely he's God, he says.
Of course.
Right. And they go crazy. They start to cut themselves and they start bleeding all over themselves, and it says that this was part of their custom.
Wow.
And they do that until it's time for the evening sacrifice. And still nothing has happened.
Nothing.
And so eventually Elijah is finally like, all right, it's my turn. And he gathers the people around, and he repairs Yahweh's altar, because there had apparently been one there which had been destroyed. And so we learn that sort of at this point in the narrative of, that's why he gathered them here. So he repairs the altar, this almost sort of a shrine's not the right word, and he prepares the sacrifice, and then he even adds onto it. He says, hey, go fill a bunch of buckets of water and pour them all over it. And he does that. He has them do that 3 times. So the wood's soaked. It even says there's just puddles of water at the base of it. Right. So now it's like a human hand couldn't set this on fire.
Yes.
There's no way you're setting this thing on fire. Right. And then he prays. Here, I want to read, because I didn't get it out, but he says, "O Yahweh, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Yahweh, answer me, that these people may know that you, O Yahweh, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back." And then it says, then the fire of Yahweh fell and consumed the burnt offering and the wood and the stones and the dust, and licked up the water that was in the trench.
Wow.
Because I forgot to mention that he placed 12 stones there at the altar to represent the 12 tribes. And then when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and said, Yahweh, he is God. Yahweh, he is God.
Wow.
It's an amazing story. It's like a powerful story. And what I want us to notice is not just like how cool, because like Elijah's a pretty cool guy in this story,
yeah.
right?
And he was very confident too. He's like, let's put water in this.
Yeah. He's confident.
Yes.
And that's cool. But I think it's so that the last piece of his prayer is that they know that you are God and that you have turned their hearts back.
Wow.
Right? Like right there, it's like this is still because Yahweh desires their hearts back.
Wow. And
this isn't the only time where, I mean, Jesse talked about it in Exodus. You know, it's been mentioned of like this covenant that they made with Yahweh was littered with the imagery and the vocabulary of marriage covenants.
Yes.
And this and many others, Yahweh's almost depicted as this just jealous husband who desires the heart of the woman that he married back.
Yes.
And it's depicted in that very passionate way sometimes. And that's what I think of, and I thought of many times throughout Kings. And he desires their hearts.
Yes.
He's like, you've turned to these other things, which just, I mean, look what it made the priests of Baal do, to start harming themselves and making fools of themselves and hurting themselves. And,
yes.
And that's not what he desires for his people. And so this goes over very well in this moment. The people are like, oh yeah, I mean, how can we deny that? Yeah, Yahweh is God. And they even round up the priests of Baal, and Elijah has them killed. And Ahab's with this. But what's interesting is what happens immediately afterwards is that they get back to Samaria, and the drought. This is the other thing. So the drought that was in the famine, it lifts. The thing that happens right after this is Elijah 7 times tells like to go look, and they see a storm coming with the rain, right? So it's going to release the drought.
Yes.
And so they go back to Samaria. When he gets back, Ahab tells Jezebel what happened, and Jezebel is mad.
Mm-hmm.
And she tries to have Elijah killed. So Elijah leaves. He runs away. But this has had an effect on Ahab, and we see that because so Elijah's currently not there because Jezebel will kill him on sight.
Right.
But what happens now is what I mentioned before. Ben-Hadad is the king of Aram, a neighboring sort of kingdom, and has waged war on Israel, on the northern kingdom. And they actually lay siege to Samaria.
Mm-hmm.
And in this narrative, he essentially makes ridiculous requests of Ahab. He says, I might let you go if you give me, all of your wives and your children and all of your gold. And Ahab's like, I can't do that. And so he's like, well, and Ben-Hadad has this long speech, and then Ahab has a great line where he says, those who, he essentially says, those who are preparing for war shouldn't speak as though they're coming home from battle.
Ooh.
And but then a prophet shows up, an unnamed one. It just says a man of God.
Mm-hmm.
He shows up on the scene, and this is in chapter 20 of First Kings still.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll have you read it.
Okay. 1 King 20:13.
Yes.
Now behold, a prophet approached Ahab, king of Israel, and said, "This is what Yahweh says. Have you seen all this great multitude? Behold, I'm going to hand them over to you today, and you shall know that I am the Lord." But Ahab said, "By whom?" So he said, "Yahweh says this, by the young men of the leaders of the provinces." Then he said, "Who will begin the battle?" And he said, "You will." Oh.
So like the young men of the leaders of the provinces essentially are like servants. So he essentially says, Yahweh said that you're going to win this battle, and servants are going to win it for you.
Wow.
And Ahab's question of who will start it is essentially, well, do I wait for them to attack me, or do I go out and attack him? Mm-hmm. And he says, you start it. So he essentially does what you said. He gathers these servants and arms them and puts them out in front of his army, and then they go out and they do exactly Ben-Hadad is like, who are these people? And they go to attack them, and it says each one strikes down his enemy, and the army is sent into a retreat. And so what's really interesting is that clearly some sort of effect had been taking place on Ahab, mm-hmm. because this man of God shows up and he's like, hey, I got advice from you on this from Yahweh. And he's like, tell me.
Yes.
Right. Yes. I saw the fire.
Exactly. I know the Lord is real. What does he say?
And he asks, like, okay, so who do I send out? And he tells him, and do I start? Like, he asks all of the questions, right, for what he should do, and then he does it. And it goes well for him. So it's interesting that while Ahab is not necessarily just like this perfect guy, right. This has had an effect on him. This what happened with Elijah. And so, and that I think that leads up a little bit to what happens next. Real quick, sort of an interesting thing is after Ben-Hadad's army is put into retreat, his advisors are like, well, their god must be the god of the mountains. But if we attack them in the hill, in like the fields or in
Yes.
the plains or something like that, then we'll win because. And that's what they try to do, and of course that doesn't work out for them either because it's the god of the mountains and the valleys, right? And
Yes.
so that's just an interesting thing that happens afterward. Now, this next section, which is essentially chapter 21, and I'm just going to read through some of this. It's an amazing story. Just when it comes to just the biblical literature, and there's just so many brushstrokes, and we'll just get into it. A lot of your Bibles will probably have it titled as Naboth's vineyard. So, I should mention before we even get into this that Ahab while Ahab listened to Yahweh for that war advice, once the battle is over, we already get the story of him ignoring. Essentially, he captures Ben-Hadad, and God says, you need to get rid of this guy. But then he makes a deal with Ben-Hadad of like, well, maybe if you give me certain things, then I'll let you go free.
Yeah.
And the man of God essentially says, yeah, this is going to end poorly for you.
Yes.
So already we can see Ahab was happy to listen to Yahweh when he was surrounded.
Yes.
And that's not nothing. But the second he's now on top again, he's rejecting that wisdom.
And it's kind of like a repeated story if you think about it.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of like it's God gives them the victory, and then they're like, oh, you know what? God is with us. We have the victory, and then they kind of get confident in themselves.
Right. I'm good now. I know what to do now.
Right. And then you see, it's a repeated pattern, and it's honestly, I feel like sometimes we're like that too, where you know what I'm saying, like God is with us, and God maybe like, you know, we've overcome something, or God has given us something, and then, you know, we kind of get this overly confidence, and we like do things without God's permission or even asking God, because we're just like, oh, you know, God is with me, and God's like, well, I didn't call you to do that. I didn't. So it's literally a repeating pattern.
Right. He gets this confidence now in his own wisdom and his own strength, even though his own wisdom and own strength was not what got him through that battle. It's not like Elijah, who has a confidence in Yahweh.
Yes.
And not just that, not simply, oh, well, I'm cool with him, so he must protect me, but in his understanding of his confidence in his obedience to that instruction. Ahab's rejecting that instruction now because he thinks he knows better.
Yes. That's good.
So, getting into this, so it says, so this is after the prophet condemns him for the release. Now Naboth the Jezreelite had a vineyard in Jezreel, beside the palace of Ahab, king of Samaria. And Ahab said to Naboth, give me your vineyard, that I may have it for a vegetable garden, because it is near my house. So he wants a garden of fruit-bearing plants already. He wants this. He says, I will give you a better vineyard for it, or if it's good to you, I will give you its value in money. And so it's like, all right, that seems, he's being fair.
Yeah.
But Naboth said to Ahab, Yahweh forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers. And what he's appealing to is the law of Moses. There was an inheritance given to the tribes and the clans, and they were explicitly not, like, if they have to sell it, it's a problem. It's like, I can't afford it anymore.
Yes.
And that's why the year of Jubilee was, if you had sold your inheritance, it will be given back to you eventually.
Yes.
Because it's not actually meant to depart from you. Mm-hmm. So what he's saying is he's like, hey, I'm not supposed to give you this. Mm. So I already want us to note some of the brushstrokes that's going on here. Ahab desires a fruit-bearing garden for himself, but can't have it because it's been forbidden by Yahweh. Mm.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah. So Ahab went into his house vexed and sullen because of what Naboth the Jezreelite had said to him, that he wouldn't give him the vineyard. And he lay down on his bed and turned his face away and would eat no food. So he throws a fit, right, in his house. But Jezebel, his wife, came to him and said, "Why is your spirit so vexed that you eat no food?" And he said, "Well, I talked to Naboth and I wanted his vineyard and he won't give it to me." And she says, Do you now govern Israel? Arise and eat bread and let your heart be cheerful. I will give you the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite. She essentially appeals of like, you're the most powerful guy here. Mm-hmm. What's the problem?
Yes.
And so it's really interesting that Ahab, while throwing a fit, is almost on the brink of like recognizing, well, he's throwing a fit, but he's not going to take it from this guy.
Yes. Yes.
And so we can see how like he's not exactly a reformed man, but we've seen some changes take place.
Yeah, like he's conflicted.
Yeah, he's still throwing a fit because this guy won't give him something, but he hasn't resorted to violence. Now, long story short, Jezebel comes up with essentially a trick. She sends a letter to the elders of the city to essentially proclaim a fast, and then to get, this is really interesting, here, in chapter 21, verse 10, she says, "And set 2 worthless men opposite him, and let them bring a charge against him, saying, 'You have cursed God and the king. Then take him out and stone him to death.'" So essentially get 2 people to falsely testify against him.
Wow.
And then kill him. And it'll seem just to people. What's really interesting about this is, so if it hasn't been made explicit already, we're talking a lot of Garden of Eden imagery here. What's really interesting is, so your translation may have different ways of translating the worthless men. Some say liars, which is also like a good way of putting it. This word is Belial, or something like that.
Yeah.
It's actually like a name, meaning like worthless one. It's actually similar to the Hebrew word in like meaning to Satan. Mm-hmm. It's a word that will get associated later with the adversarial being behind the serpent, behind the sin knocking at the door, all that kind of stuff, right? Yes. And so we've got this serpent, this liar, that's now being involved in this too, this trickery, this cunningness, right? And so it's all very just. It's brilliant. Like I'm scratching the surface probably of what's going on in narrative and literarily. I can't speak my own language. But so then this is what they do. So this is what happens. They proclaim the fast. They get 2 guys to come in and to testify falsely against this guy, and he gets killed for it. And then she says, she goes to Ahab and says, "Arise, take possession of the vineyard, for Naboth the Jezreelite, which he refused to give you, is not alive, but dead." And as soon as Ahab heard that he was dead, he rose to go down to the vineyard of Naboth to take possession of it. So we can see he's not that upset.
Of course.
Right? Just like in the Garden of Eden where Eve hands the fruit to Adam, Adam doesn't hesitate.
Yes. Oh, that's good.
It's an equal fall.
Yes.
Yes. Adam doesn't resist that. Now, there's also echoes too, not just of that, but of the narrative that happens afterwards with Cain and Abel, where now blood has been spilled. He's sort of risen up against his brother, so to speak, because he was jealous for something that he had.
Yes.
And so now in both of those narratives, after Cain had killed Abel and after they had eaten the fruit, what happens next? God shows up.
Yes.
Right? And what happens next?
Mm-hmm.
Then the word of Yahweh came to Elijah, saying, Arise, go down to meet Ahab, king of Israel, who is in Samaria. Behold, he is in the vineyard of Naboth, where he has gone to take possession. Yeah. And you shall say to him, Thus says Yahweh, have you killed and also taken possession? And you shall say to him, Thus says Yahweh, in the place where dogs licked up the blood of Naboth, shall dogs lick up your own blood.
Oof.
And so there's this also, again, this echo, right? Your
Mhm.
brother's blood calls out to me,
Falls out.
the ground. And what's I think is powerful here too about what's going on is that, so we've got a prophet who's now called to say, hey, something bad has happened, and there's going to be consequences for that. Okay, and then so verse 20, Ahab said to Elijah, so Elijah goes, and Ahab says to Elijah, have you found me, my enemy? He refers to Elijah as his enemy, and Elijah says, I found you because you have sold yourself to do what is evil in the sight of Yahweh. Behold, I will bring disaster upon you. I will utterly burn you up and will cut off from Ahab every male, bond or free, in Israel. I will make your house like the house of Jeroboam and like the house of Baasha, for the anger to which you have provoked me, and because you have made Israel to sin. So that's already interesting, right? It's like, hey, this isn't actually just about this event.
Yes.
Right? We're coming to the, and this is important too, right? It's like, so just like in those stories, Yahweh is showing up here as the consequences.
Yes.
Right? Something bad has happened. When the consequences show up, that's Yahweh showing up. And of Jezebel, Yahweh also said, the dogs shall eat Jezebel within the walls of Jezreel. Anyone belonging to Ahab who dies in the city, the dogs shall eat, and anyone of this who dies in the open country, the birds of the heavens shall eat.
Wow.
Yeah, not stories for kids.
No, not at all.
It's gritty. So we've talked before about this pattern, right? Of, okay, well, a prophet shows up and they have prophecy, warning, right? And we've seen that, but we haven't quite seen that second part that we talked about.
Right.
Elijah doesn't specify like a call to relationship with Yahweh, but we'll read what comes literally the next verse, starting in 25. We'll read this. This is, 1 Kings chapter 21. If you're lost, I apologize.
No, you're fine.
And then starting at verse 25. So here it is. Oh, sorry.
Okay. There certainly was no one like Ahab.
Oh, wait, sorry. Oh yeah, no. I'm sorry. That's the right place. Yeah.
Okay. It says, 1 Kings 21:25. There certainly was no one like Ahab who gave himself over to do evil in the sight of the Lord, because Jezebel, his wife, incited him. He also acted very despicably in following idols, conforming to everything that the Amorites had done, whom Yahweh drove out from the sons of Israel. Verse 27. Yet it came about when Ahab heard these words that he tore his clothes and put on a sackcloth and fasted. And he lay in sackcloth and went about despondently. Then the word of Yahweh came to Elijah the Tishbite, saying, do you see how Ahab has humbled himself before me? Because he has humbled himself before me, I will not bring the disaster in his days. I will bring the disaster upon his house in his son's days. Wow.
So this is like, this just jumped out to me when I read it, because it even takes the time right before to say this dude was terrible.
Yes.
It gives you a whole paragraph, there's 2 verses of just, he was terrible, he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, he followed idols. And yet, when he heard what had been said by the prophet, he humbles himself before Yahweh. He has a fear for Yahweh. And that elicits a response. That's something that Yahweh cares about.
Yes.
So while God is what shows up when the consequences must be dealt with, and so he's a God of justice that shows up when a crime has been committed, so to speak. He also has this compassion when someone asks for mercy from him. And in the this is the thing too, how the Bible recontextualizes stories, and when you go back and meditate on things after reading the rest of it, because it set this so much up to mimic the story of the Garden of Eden, and then at the end of it, it's like there's consequences, right? Just like there were in Eden. But then Ahab, he humbles himself before Yahweh, and Yahweh relents on some of those consequences. And it makes you sort of like think again about the Garden of Eden, and about what was going on there, right? And it's the narrative of like Yahweh is ever revealing himself to his people and to us now through this word, so that we continue to learn more, so we don't have to think about what might have been necessarily, right? And it's so powerful, right? That despite these consequences, I mean, he just said, hey, this is what's going to happen. And then Ahab essentially humbles himself, asks for mercy, and God gives it to him. He changes what he said, right? It's so fascinating, and it's so, I mean, it's difficult, I think, to a little bit, because it is. We're like, wait, this guy deserves it.
Yes, yeah, and it's like we were talking about, like you said, the Bible, especially the narrators, they don't have a problem, showing and demonstrating like, the God of justice, but the God of mercy, right. and we were talking like, as humans, we're like, no, he deserves all that, that the Lord said he would do. And the moment that Ahab humbles himself, you said, we see God shows up and he speaks and he's merciful upon him. And like you said, God is there with consequences because he's a God of justice, but he's also a God of mercy. And we see that repentance, we see the humbleness, and God speaks. And it's the same with us. God does the same with us. Like he's the same. When we humble ourselves and we come to him, he's faithful to forgive us.
Right.
And show mercy. So it's hard. It's hard to kind of, see that. And as humans, it's hard to comprehend God, because we limit to what we think, because us as humans, we can say, as I mentioned, he deserved that. He was evil. And it clearly says it in the Bible, how evil he was. And like you said, before God showed mercy on him, God wanted us to know, the narrator wanted us to know, this man was evil, but he humbled himself before the Lord.
Right.
And God,
because mercy itself relies on the preconception of justice.
Yes.
Right. If you can't make a case that they deserve it, then you can't really make a case for mercy was given.
Yes.
Right.
That's good.
And this itself is echoing of like when Cain kills Abel. Right, God exiles him, and Cain says, "Well, I can't bear that. I'm going to die."
Yes,
and I don't want to die. And God says, "No, I'll protect you." Like he killed someone.
Yes,
right. But he says, "No, I'll protect you."
Wow.
Yeah, and so we see that character continue to be shown and developed and contextualized in these stories. Ahab, and God knows where this is going. So this is the other thing too, right? So I think I want to address it too. Right at the end, it's like, well, I'm going to unleash it on his sons. And it's like, wait, is that just? Like, what did his sons do? Well, if you keep reading, we're not getting into it. But yes. God is in all places at all times. God knows what his sons are going to do.
Exactly. That kind of sounds unfair. Like, oh, I'm going to save you, but I'm going to put it on your son. Right. You're like, wait, what? They're not.
But if you read, you get the story. We're not going to get into it, but we get the story of his son as well. And his son also does a bunch of terrible stuff and doesn't humble himself in front of the
Yes.
Lord. And so the word comes to pass.
Yes.
Um, so Ahab isn't even, again, he's not ever like, oh, just this fully redeemed guy who turns around and is like, you know what, I'm gonna start loving people, I'm gonna start being a nice guy. We don't see that happen in the story. And you can read his story yourself. But he eventually he passes away, as we all do, and the story continues. We're going to jump a little bit ahead. Like I said, I would like to comb through every little bit of this with you guys, and please talk to me, at church or whatever, if you have questions too that you didn't think of. Like, I know that happens to me a lot. Like, I don't think of something in the moment, but later when I'm meditating on it, that's where those questions come. And those questions, they come because that's what part of the point of meditating. And I found that for me and my relationship with God and with his word has been very much through questions. You ask these questions because that's exploring it. It's not accusing it of something. It's asking, well, what does this mean? Or why is this way? Or, and that asking questions allows for answers. God can't answer questions that aren't asked.
Absolutely. And that's how you get to, well, let's talk about humanly. How do you get to know someone? You ask them questions. That's how you get a deeper understanding of who the person is. And so I completely agree. I feel like sometimes we're scared to ask questions, but God is not afraid of questions. He wants us to ask questions. He wants us to know him. So
yeah, I love the story in Genesis with Abraham when he's with the Sodom and Gomorrah. He's just like, well, what about like 50 people? So it's like, yeah, after 50 people. He's like haggling with God, and God's not haggling. He's like, no, I'll be as merciful as you asked me to be.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. I know that story always fascinates me. Like, he's really like going back and forth with God.
Right. And it's so unnecessary. I think that's what's so funny. Is like we see it's almost like he doesn't expect. He's like 10 would probably be not enough for God, so I'll start at 50. Like, it's a haggling, like he's trading, right? And Yahweh doesn't haggle with mercy; he just gives it. So jumping, actually, now we cross the span between First Kings and Second Kings, which is, as you read it, you'll see is almost seemingly arbitrary division that's really length-based, as far as I understand it. Though obviously I could easily be wrong. But it's even in the middle of one of the king's rules. But essentially, we're going to be jumping actually forward to the fall of Israel, the northern kingdom. If you remember, I guess I didn't recap that particular part at the beginning of this, but if you remember from me talking in part 1, the story ends with the fall of both the northern and the southern kingdoms. The northern kingdom gets overrun by Assyria, and the southern by Babylon. And really, all of this is this story up until those points of Yahweh trying to prevent it by bringing the people back to him, and of them continuously rejecting that. Now, just, and I'm going to let the text explain why this happens. So the Assyrians have come in, they laid siege to Samaria, they take it over, they deport the people into exile, and they bring people there in place of them. It was a common strategy of an empire of the time, because if you leave all of the people there in the town, like, you don't necessarily want to kill all of them, you leave them all there, well, now they're all unified and they can rebel against you.
Yes.
So it's sort of this cultural strategy of, if I scatter you into my empire and bring other people and put you there, then you're going to get culturally diluted, you're going to start absorbing our culture more, and you'll get assimilated. So they get deported out of the northern kingdom. But but the narrator stops in chapter 17, and to talk about the fall. And then starting at verse 7, it just gives a long synopsis of exactly why this happens, which goes until verse 23. I'm only going to have you, Karina, read a few verses, which I think are a good summary. Okay. So starting at verse 13.
1 Kings 21:13.
I made that wrong. It's 2 Kings. I apologize.
2 Kings. 2 Kings 21, verse 13, it says, "Yet Yahweh warned Israel and Judah through all his prophets and every seer, saying, Turn back from your evil ways and keep my commandments and my statutes in accordance with all the law which I commanded your fathers, in which I sent to you through my servants and the prophets. However, they did not listen, but stiffened their neck like their fathers, who did not believe in Yahweh their God. They rejected his statutes and his covenant which he made with their fathers, and his warnings which he gave them. And they followed idols and became empty, and followed the nations that surrounded them, about which Yahweh had commanded them not to do as they did." Verse 16, "And they abandoned all the commandments of Yahweh their God, and made for themselves cast metal images, 2 calves, and they made in Asherah and worshipped all the heavenly lights and served Baal. Then they made their sons and their daughters pass through the fire, and they practiced divination and interpreting omens, and gave themselves over to do evil in the sight of Yahweh, provoking him. So Yahweh was very angry with Israel, and he removed them from his sight. No one was left except the tribe of Judah." Verse 19, "Judah did not keep the commandments of the Lord their God either, but they followed the customs which Israel had introduced."
So that last line is good in case you thought this was some propaganda of how great Judah is.
Yes.
The narrator does not, even though he's focusing, that they're focusing here on the fall of Israel.
Yes.
It's careful to immediately say, but Judah also was not doing it. Real quick, the making their children pass through the fire is a figure of speech. It's talking about child sacrifice. And you can kind of almost see their discomfort with even talking about it, because they're sort of using this idiom, if you will, to even refer to it.
Right.
So obviously things were bad and they were getting worse. And while an overtaking of the king of Assyria overthrowing them isn't pretty either, it's when you've been reaping destruction, eventually that's what gets sown.
Yes.
And what we've seen, and like I said, we've only hit a few of like these big moments, is many prophets coming to both the southern and the northern kingdom to call them back into that relationship. And it's a sad picture, because when you read this, it's almost like, well, God tried. Right? It almost has that feeling of, yes, well, he tried and it didn't work out, and so sorry, Israel, you're put.
Yes.
But just a few verses later in the same chapter in 2 Kings, here, let me bring up the reference, because I think I might have messed up some of these, like the chapters, but here, 2 Kings 17, so same chapter, starting at 27. So what happens actually here, let me give you some context here, is that a bunch of Assyrians move into Samaria, but bad, like, lions start coming and attacking people, and there's these plagues that come, and so this is the response of the Assyrian king. You can read it.
Okay. 2 Kings 17:27. Then the king of Assyria issued command saying, take one of the priests there whom you led into exile and have him go and live there and have him teach them the custom of the God of the land. So one of the priests who they had led into exile from Samaria came and lived in Bethel and taught them how they were to fear Yahweh.
So what that tells us is God's not done.
Yes.
Right? The story isn't over. And it's a really interesting way of saying it, of course, but and they don't, it tells us that he tries to teach him, and what they start doing is they just add Yahweh to their pantheon of deities, and they worship him, but they worship a bunch of other stuff, and they don't really get it, and they're not following the commandments. But what we see is that just because Assyria's come in doesn't mean that God's done with this land, that he's done with the Israelites,
right?
That he's done with the people that were in the northern kingdom. So there's already this isn't the end of the story. This is not a great point, but there's something, God's still doing something.
Yes.
And he still had promises. And so this story's not over. We don't know where it's going, but it's not over.
Right.
Now, the story's also not over because there's still Judah down south. They don't taken over by the Assyrians. Mm-hmm. Over in chapter 21. Judah's kings continue on for more generations. Mm-hmm. And again, like the southern kings have been, there's sort of a mix of approval and disapproval from the narrator. Mostly disapproval. And we even eventually we get to this king Hezekiah. Hezekiah is pretty great. He gets a positive approval, and he trusts God. And when the Assyrians come to sort of knock on Jerusalem's door of like, hey, let's go take that kingdom out too. Yes. Hezekiah trusts in Yahweh to protect them. And it's really because there's this messenger from the Assyrians that comes, and he's talking to them, and he's like, don't you guys think that your God's going to protect you, because a lot of people had gods and we took them over.
Yes. And
Hezekiah, after this guy comes and has this big speech that's very intimidating, mm-hmm. He sends word to the prophet Isaiah, and which you guys probably know the name of. He's one of the major prophets. He has his own book of his namesake, which we will get into eventually. But he essentially, there's this whole poem essentially that is Yahweh's response. Mm-hmm. Which I would love to read for you here, just because it's like really so yeah. He says, so thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, your prayer to me, talking to Hezekiah's prayer to Yahweh for help in this. Your prayer to me about the king of Assyria I have heard. This is the word that Yahweh has spoken concerning him. She despises you, she scorns you, the virgin daughter of Zion. She wags her head behind you, the daughter of Jerusalem. Whom have you mocked and reviled? Against whom have you raised your voice and lifted your eyes to the heights? Against the Holy One of Israel. By your messengers you have mocked the Lord, and you have said, with my many chariots I have gone up the heights of the mountains, to the far recesses of Lebanon. I felled its tallest cedars, its choicest cypresses. I entered its farthest lodging place and its most fruitful forest. I dug wells and drank foreign waters, and I dried up with the sole of my foot all the streams of Egypt. But have you not heard that I determined it long ago? I planned from days of old what now I bring to pass, that you should turn fortified cities into heaps of ruins, while their inhabitants, shorn of strength and dismayed and confounded, and have become like plants of the field and like tender grass, like grass on the housetops, blighted before it is grown. But I know you're sitting down and you're going in and you're coming out and you're raging against me. The I know you're sitting down is like, I know where you live.
Yes.
Because you have raged against me and your complacency has come into my ears.
Wow.
I will put my hook in your nose and my bit in your mouth, and I will turn you back the way by which you came.
Oof.
And what follows is that it's an angel. He sends an angel, and the angel just kills a bunch of the Assyrians. And so the king's like, I'm out of here.
Yeah, yeah.
Which I would be too, you know? And so it's just as powerful, like he's still here, powerfully working. And it's because Hezekiah asked for the help.
Yes.
And then it can be given, right? And how much he wants to do that. The problem is that the king that immediately follows Hezekiah, some people may also know the name of, is Manasseh.
Yes.
And I'll read some of this. Is chapter 21. We get introduced to Manasseh. Again, some of these sections are just too long to put onto a page, and
yes.
They're really provocative when just read as a whole. It says Manasseh was 12 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 55 years in Jerusalem. That actually makes him like the longest reigning king of the southern kingdom. I think even the northern kingdom. Yeah. Solomon and David each reigned for 40 years, for example. His mother name was Hephzibah, and he did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, according to the despicable practices of the nation whom Yahweh drove out before the people of Israel. So it's being compared to the Canaanites when they came into the land, and they were told, they were told, hey, you're not coming in here because of your righteousness, but because of how wicked the people in the land are.
Yes.
He rebuilt the high places that Hezekiah his father had destroyed. He erected altars for Baal and made an Asherah pole, and Ahab king of Israel had done, and worshipped all the host of heaven and served them. That's the heavenly lights, the stars, essentially, like divination and things like that. And he built altars in the house of Yahweh, of which Yahweh had said, in Jerusalem will I put my name. He put altars for other gods inside the temple.
Yes.
He built altars for all the host of heaven in the two courts of the house of the Lord. He burned his son as an offering and used fortune-telling and omens and dealt with mediums and with necromancers. He did much evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. And the carved image of Asherah that he made, he set in the house of which the Lord had said to David and Solomon, in this house and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever, and I will not cause the feet of Israel to wander any more out of the land that I gave to their fathers. If only they will be careful to do according to all that I have commanded them, and according to all the law that my servant Moses commanded them. But they did not listen, and Manasseh led them astray to do more evil than the nations had done, whom the Lord destroyed before the people of Israel.
Wow.
They're worse than the Canaanites now. It's crazy. And
you think it's getting better, but it's not.
Right. It's not. Right. It's escalating.
Yes. Yes.
And which I think, and we'll talk about it more, but this escalation is also important in the wisdom of it needs to end. It needs to be stopped at some point because it will escalate out of control.
Yes.
It's already fairly out of control, but it's going to escalate to more violence and more harm.
Right.
Now, the prophets come in here. So it says, this is verse 10 of chapter 21. The Lord said by his servants, the prophets, because Manasseh, king of Judah, has committed these abominations, and has done more evil than all that the Amorites did, who were before him, and has made Judah also to sin with his idols. Therefore, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, behold, I am bringing upon Jerusalem and Judah such disaster that the ears of everyone who hears of it will tingle. And I will stretch over Jerusalem the measuring line of Samaria, and the plumb line of the house of Ahab, and I will wipe Jerusalem as one wipes a dish, wiping it and turning it upside down. I will forsake the remnant of my heritage and give them into the hand of their enemies. They shall become a prey and a spoil to all their enemies, because they have done what is evil in my sight, have provoked me to anger since the day their fathers came out of Egypt, even to this day. Moreover, Manasseh shed very much innocent blood, till he had filled Jerusalem from one end to the other, besides the sin that he made Judah to sin, so that he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord.
Wow.
Like he filled Jerusalem with the blood of the innocent.
Wow.
Right? This is, I mean, all of these indications of just how bad this gets. And this is 55 years of this.
Wow.
The longest reigning king, and it's it's the worst reign.
Wow.
Right? And it's really morbid, and Yahweh's very angry.
Yes.
And unlike maybe Ahab, Manasseh doesn't show in this narrative a return, a humbling that doesn't come up here. And it's really interesting when it says they have provoked me to anger since the day their fathers came out of Egypt, even to this day. So this also is like, it's not just about Manasseh.
Yes.
It's about all of it.
Yes.
We've been going through. You guys have been with us through all of it, right?
Literally. Yes. Yes.
It's been a bit of a train wreck.
Yes.
It seems like. And so what we're seeing is not just the consequences of one king's actions, or two kings, or three kings, or all of the kings of Israel, or all of its judges, but since they cheated on Yahweh on the wedding night, with the golden calf. Since they immediately after being taken out of Egypt, they wanted to go back, because it's been a very one-sided relationship for y'all.
Man.
And so we're seeing that just blow up in Manasseh. It's just getting worse. And now they're worse than the people that were in the land before them, that they were meant to drive out, to stop what was going on, and then be different from.
Yes.
And now they're worse. So it doesn't even take like a prophet to have like a spiritual gift of prophecy to know where this is going.
Yes.
Right? You just have to read. And in a way, that's a lot of the prophets are people who have studied and meditated on the scripture and the narrative, and have come to an understanding of God's character. They understand history so well that they can predict the future. And that's, of course, that wisdom is given to them through the Spirit of Yahweh. But it's not just simply it is visions, and it is things like that. But it is also just this intimate understanding of what has happened before.
Yes.
Of reading just Yahweh's been trying to make it very clear to them. They had a covenant. That covenant had terms, and there was warnings about what happens when you break that. And they have not broken it just once, but continuously
through generations.
Generations.
Generations. It's a generational thing where we see them breaking the law, breaking God's commandments, turning away from God. And it's a good that you highlighted that he said from the moment that they left Egypt. Because like you said, we can base this off because of how they are right now. But no, this is all consequences because of what happened, them coming out of Egypt. They started coming out of Egypt. They started worshiping idols. God was like, no, no. And even then, we still see throughout the narrative, God is still with the children of Israel because he's still with them. He's still speaking through the prophets. Like, God is not silent. He is.
And this has been, and it's when we're reading it, because we're reading it just in lines on paper, right?
Yes.
Like the scale of time that we're talking about. I mean, just Kings is like 400 years. It's like way longer than even the nation that we live in has been a nation.
Yes.
And this is talking about history that goes hundreds of years before that.
Yes.
Right? Like, it's easy for us to maybe look at this and be like, oh, well, that seems a little severe. Like, it's been hundreds of years in the making.
Yes. Hundreds of years of them not listening and them turning
Right.
away from God.
Right. Every generation
Yes.
had a call, multiple calls back, you know? And it's just they're causing more harm. They're supposed to be a blessing to the nations. That was the promise to Abraham, right? Your descendants will be a blessing to the nations. The promise to Eve was that a descendant of hers would be the snake crusher.
Yes.
You know, he made promises to David about his line, about a king that would come from his line. And we're seeing, wait, but how is that going to happen?
Yes.
Because it's getting worse.
It's getting worse, yes.
Now, it doesn't get all bad at the end. There's one more good king of Judah. And that king is Josiah. Josiah, he becomes king when he's 8 years old.
Crazy. 8 years old.
But he reigned 31 years, so he had a pretty good reign. But this is crazy. So, like, if you're like, wow, man, it's almost like they've forgotten about the law and the covenant.
Yes.
Well, what we learned in Josiah is that's almost basically the case. I mean,
Yes.
what we saw was that during Manasseh's reign, right, he set up a bunch of altars and other worship places in the temple.
Mm-hmm.
So the stuff associated with Yahweh has been covered and buried,
Yes.
and put in closets and stuff like that. So it does have to be refound, and that's what happens in Josiah's reign. So Josiah grew up in Manasseh's Israel. So he didn't know that this was a problem, right? He was like, oh, well, that's what the temple is. And
right.
But what they find, because he essentially says we're gonna repair the temple. The temple's it's old, it's getting old, and it's been taking a beating because we keep putting stuff in it. And who knows what they're doing, you know?
Yes.
And a priest finds what's referred to as like the book of the law or the book of the Torah or book of instruction.
Mm-hmm.
It's not known necessarily exactly what book this is, whether or not it's actually one of the books that we have, at least in the form that we have it.
Mm-hmm.
But it's certainly something that's detailing their history with Yahweh and the covenant that they made with him. And Josiah reads it and gets upset.
Yes.
And when he finds out about it, he's like, we got to talk to someone. We need a prophet. We need to talk to Yahweh, right? Because we've messed up. This is not good. We need to talk to Yahweh. So he sends for a prophet in chapter 22, starting at verse 15. This is a prophet named Huldah. Huldah is actually a prophetess, a woman who's a prophet.
Okay.
And she's apparently a prophet for Yahweh during this period of time, right? Which has got to be crazy.
Yes.
And I can't imagine maybe her surprise at hearing, hey, the king of Israel has questions for Yahweh.
Yes.
Like the king of Israel knows who he is.
Exactly.
Right? After all that happened with Manasseh, right? So we should have that one, right?
2 Kings.
Yep.
22.
So this is what her prophecy is.
Verse 15. Then she said to them, "This is what Yahweh, the God of Israel, says. Tell the man who sent you to me. This is what Yahweh says. Behold, I'm going to bring disaster on this place and on its inhabitants. All the words of the book which the king of Judah has read, since they have abandoned me and have burned incense to other gods, so that they may provoke me to anger with all the work of their hands. My wrath burns against this place, and it shall not be quenched. But to the king of Judah who sent you to inquire of Yahweh, this is what you shall say to him. This is what Yahweh, the God of Israel, says regarding the words which you have read. Since your heart was tender and you humbled yourself before the Lord, when you heard what I spoke against this place and against its inhabitants, that they would become an object of horror and a curse, and you have torn your clothes and wept before me, I have indeed heard you, declares Yahweh. Verse 20. Therefore, behold, I am going to gather you to your fathers, and you will be gathered to your grave in peace. And your eyes will not look at all the devastation that I'm going to bring on this place. So they brought back word to the king.
Yeah. Now, what's interesting about this is, so we've talked about, right, the pattern. So there's a warning here. And here, again, it's like, well, is there really like a call to relationship? Well, we see that there is in the response that Josiah gives to this. So
Yes.
Josiah could respond to this as being, Josiah could respond to this by saying, oh, well, I guess I'm set and there's nothing that we can do. So whatever. I guess I'll serve Yahweh, and then and what will come to pass will come to pass.
Yes.
That's not actually what Josiah does. His immediate his response to this in chapter 23, the next chapter, we'll read is, so he goes through a bunch of reforms, and we'll read it here in chapter 23.
Chapter 23, verse 15. Moreover, the altar at Bethel, the high place erected by Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin, that altar with the high place, he pulled down and burned, reducing it to dust. He also burned the Asherah, and as Josiah turned, he saw the tombs there on the mount. And he sent and took the bones out of the tombs and burned them on the altar and defiled it, according to the word of Yahweh with the man of God of Yahweh that the man of God proclaimed, who had predicted these things.
So it's referring to actually back in Jeroboam's reign, right? The first king of the northern kingdom as a divided nation. When he had made those golden calves and then was sacrificing on the altar, a man of God comes and he prophesies that there will be a king named Josiah who will do these things. And so this is also a cue to us that maybe we're getting towards the end of this immediate story.
Yes.
Because it's starting to come full circle. But he actually, so that's just a small snippet of the story. But he brings the people, he reads the book of the law.
Yes.
He says, hey, this is our covenant, and you guys all need to know it. And they restart their covenant with Yahweh. Wow. They celebrate Passover for the first time in who knows how long.
Wow.
Right? And it's a radical turn back to Yahweh, and we can see that Yahweh responds to Josiah. He says that it's not going to stop what's coming at this point. It's almost like it's too far gone. Is a way to think about it, but I do think it's actually more complicated than that. Here, so one thing it says that it says in chapter 23, verse 25, before him there was no king like him who turned to Yahweh with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his might, according to the law of Moses, nor did any like him arise after him. Still, Yahweh did not turn from the burning of his great wrath, by which his anger was kindled against Judah, because of all the provocations with which Manasseh had provoked him. So I think when I was reading this, I thought about Ahab and how Ahab was such a terrible king. But no matter how bad a king, it couldn't stop Yahweh's mercy.
Yes.
And here we're almost seeing that Josiah was a great king, but he can't stop judgment.
Mm.
And he can't save the people.
Yes.
He can't, because this problem is going to continue. Josiah is going to die, and the next king is going to go right back to idol worship.
Yes.
It doesn't last.
Mm-hmm.
And the king after him. And Yahweh knows this, of course, right? Josiah it gives him this honor, right? That there's no one like him and before him and no one like him after, that turned so radically, essentially.
Yes.
Like that turned from a child who was raised in a culture that, right? And then he just finds this and he's so moved by it that he turns zealously back to Yahweh. But even that violent turn, that radical turn, it's not going to save them from the breaking of the covenant. Josiah can't save them from their sins, right? And that justice still is coming. That those consequences. That's really what maybe should be. Is even more to the point. Josiah can't stop the consequences.
Yes.
He can't stand between all generations and the consequences of their sin.
Right.
And that's what's being acknowledged here by the narrator, by Yahweh. Is he was awesome?
Yes.
But it's going to take more than awesome.
Yes.
Right? Yep. Because it's been really bad, and it's just, even if it's like, great, we started fresh, it's going to get bad again.
Exactly, because at one point he is going to die.
Right.
And there's going to be a new king.
And there's going to be a new king, and who knows what that guy's going to be
exactly.
Like. In this case, it's Jehoahaz, and he gets a bad rating. His son gets a bad rating. Josiah is the last good king of Judah. Now, there's not that many more.
Right.
We're right around the corner. In fact, so the decisions that they lead into, that these other kings lead, they turn back to idol worship immediately. They get abused by Egypt. It's really interesting. Egypt comes up and attacks and makes them build stuff and tax them and puts a puppet king. They're like, oh, wow, they've gotten what their ancestors wanted in a way, to go back to Egypt, and it's not great.
Yes.
And then eventually, the even bigger bad than Egypt, Babylon, shows up on the doorstep, and Babylon means business.
Yes.
And when there's not a king like Hezekiah to lean on Yahweh in that time, they fall immediately.
Yeah.
Now, it sort of happens in two stages. First, Babylon comes and defeats Judah and Jerusalem, and they essentially take the king captive, and then they put another guy as a puppet king of here, you've seen what we can do, you listen to us, and you just manage this area, and then they leave. But then that guy rebels against Babylon. So Babylon's like, we're not doing this again. Babylon's way less merciful than Yahweh is.
Yes.
They're like, oh, you're going to rebel against us? That's it. And they come in, they destroy, they raze Jerusalem, they destroy the temple, they deport all the people just like Assyria did in Samaria into Babylon. And and so it's looking just like it did for Samaria, for Israel. It looked pretty bad, but just like we had for Israel, where we had this little tag of well, but this priest was sent back to teach them about Yahweh. We're also going to get a little tag right at the end of 2 Kings, a little glimmer of hope at the end of chapter 25, which I'll have you read for us. 2 Kings chapter 25, starting at verse 27.
Now it came about in the 37th year of the exile of
I'm sorry
Jehoshaphat,
for the names.
Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, in the 12th month, on the 27th day of the month, that evil Mordecai, king of Babylon, in the year that he became king, released Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, from prison. And he spoke kindly to him and set his throne above the throne of the kings who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoshaphat changed his prison clothes and had his meals in the king's presence regularly all the days of his life. And as his allowance, a regular allowance was given to him by the king, a portion for each day, all the days of his life.
So it's this interesting little tag of where it jumps forward decades into exile, and um, and tells us that this king that they had initially taken, this guy had been king for 3 months when
Wow.
Babylon attacked, and took him. He surrendered, and they took him captive and brought him back to Babylon.
Mhm.
And so he wasn't even there for the rebellion of the puppet king and all of that. But these, like, decades in, there's this like favor that's shown, that, and it's this glimmer of like there's something going on still. This isn't the end of the story.
Exactly.
And we shouldn't expect it to be the end of the story, because there's promises. And if we've been shown anything, it's that Yahweh has been with them, has been calling them, has been working to this bitter end, and will continue.
Yes.
That he's been faithful, and that he's going to continue even despite the unfaithfulness of his people.
Yes.
And so we get that little glimmer of hope at the end of this story isn't over, and it's not. Everyone may recognize that we're not that far into the Old Testament.
No.
Now narratively, we're like might be deeper than you think. We've talked about the prophets here in the Second Kings, and we're going to eventually be getting into a lot of the books in our Old Testament are books written by prophets. Some of them during this period of time, like during the period of Kings, warning them of the coming Assyria, of Babylon. And so we get more. We get the mentions of the prophets and their tension with the kings. These books will give us more insight into what they say and into the character of Yahweh.
Yes.
And then also prophets that come during the time of the exile, and then even after it, and we'll get to that. I wanted to share something really interesting as sort of a fun side note. I know we're almost done, but I came across it sort of by happenstance while I was doing research for this. But these are Babylonian cuneiform tablets so the one on the left actually is a cuneiform tablet which is detailing the events of this end of Kings, where it details Nebuchadnezzar's attack of Judah and the capture of its king, the instantiation of a puppet king, and then eventually the complete takeover of Jerusalem.
Wow.
And even more interesting to me, at least, the second tablet was like it was almost like a grocery list. So you remember how it says that there was like an allowance given to the king when he was taken out of. So this mentions him. It mentions the Babylonian version of his name as King of Judah, and then it has the things that they were sending to him. It's like a shipping label almost, right? And it mentions his sons and things like that. So it's really, I just thought it was like just the historical sort of archaeology sort of nerd in me sort of just was like, oh, that's really cool. Of these records from Babylon of these events that are being spoken of, which is just really, really cool. Now we're getting towards the end, but I do want to talk about what is the second theme. We talked about one theme through all of this, which was Covenant Watcher. The second theme is a complex God. And what I mean by that is that it's not just in Kings, it's been all the way up to now, but I think Kings is a perfect opportunity to talk on it, which is that there's a complex portrait of God given that it's continuing to unfold to us, or continuing to be revealed to us through the Word, and it's difficult for us. It's almost seems in tension, right? We talk a lot of these moments where this concept of he's a God of justice, but he's also a God of mercy are in tension, and I wanted to speak to how that tension, I think, is more uncomfortable for us, or we like to shy away from it more than the biblical authors do.
Yeah.
And there was a metaphor that I thought was really useful that I believe I heard from Tim Mackey in the Bible Project, about the relationship, how we have this difference. We draw a line between punishments and consequences, which, when it comes to God, the biblical authors don't see a distinction as much. And the example that they gave was, if a fish jumps out of the water onto a dock, it's going to eventually die because of its nature.
Yes.
It can't survive on the dock. It's entered a realm that it doesn't belong in. We might describe that as being the consequences of it leaving the realm of which it can survive and entering an environment it can't survive in.
Right.
Now, the biblical authors might, and we would, if we said, but if instead we said, well, let's say God just like sent a bolt of lightning and killed the fish on the dock,
yes,
as punishment for leaving the water. The biblical authors don't see as much of a distinction between a consequence, a natural consequence, and a punishment from the just God, because he is the creator God. So in a way, he is the reason that fish dies, because it jumped onto the dock.
Right.
And so these concepts, this distinction between a punishment and a consequence for actions, Yahweh is the thing that shows up to give consequences.
Yes.
We see that in the narrative, right? We see it from the first chapters of Genesis.
Yes.
What happens when something's been done wrong? Yahweh shows up.
Shows up. Yes.
Right? He's what you answer to.
Yes.
But he's also the thing which shows you mercy. He's the thing which teaches you to avoid, to not jump onto the dock.
Yes.
Right? And which, when you ask, picks you up off the dock and puts you back into the water. Instead of allowing the consequences,
exactly,
which the biblical authors would also think of as punishment in a way.
Yes.
And so we see this portrait come through vibrantly, I think, in Kings, where this is all leading up to the fish on the dock dies. It keeps jumping out of the water.
Yes.
And eventually it's going to die. And is that a punishment or is that a consequence? Well, what's the difference when it's the creator God?
Yes.
Who's in all times and in all events.
Absolutely.
Who designed it all, right? Exactly. Who's in control of it all. And that's an uncomfortable thing for us to wrestle with. And I think to a certain extent, it may have been for them as well, but they're very clear about, or they're very willing to depict that complicated, and almost to us sometimes it feels contrary.
Yes.
You know, like, is he merciful or is he just?
Or is he just? Yes.
Right. They have to be one or the other. But surprise, surprise, the huge supreme creator being doesn't fit into simple boxes that we can draw with our words that easily. And it's a blessing even that we have this word that being loves us and desires to reveal its nature to us, even though we can't fully fathom yet that nature in its entirety. That Yahweh wants to have that relationship with them. He keeps saying, stop jumping on the dock.
Yes.
Stop jumping on the dock.
Yes.
You know, please stop jumping. Go back in the water. Stop jumping on the dock. For hundreds of years, right? And it keeps getting worse and worse, right? The metaphor has its limits, but that, and we'll see this especially as we get into the prophets, and that's why I think it's also really good to talk about that right now and acknowledge it, because that's going to just be amplified when we get into the prophets talking about this, because the prophets will like talk about it as consequences brought and wrought and given by Yahweh.
Mm-hmm.
And what we see in Kings is almost like that there's these consequences, and not just in Kings, but what we see since the original sin is a portrait of Yahweh which brings those consequences, which is the justice, because he's a just God, and that's part of goodness. But part of goodness is also mercy.
Mercy.
And so he also is the thing which is holding those consequences back as much as can be reasonably done.
Mm-hmm.
And we see it the moment that sin enters the human heart, that the consequences were, on that day you will die.
Yes.
And the reality is, I'm going to hold that death out as much.
Mm-hmm.
And when Cain kills his brother Abel, the consequences are life for a life.
Life for a life.
But I'm going to hold that back. I'm going to protect you from death. And what the narrative has shown so far is almost to us like, that's nice, God, but it doesn't seem to be working. It just allows humans to escalate their violence. I mean, Cain goes and he ends up building a city, and then his descendants just have escalated that idea. Yeah. They're like, well, now God has to protect me more. And so in Kings, we get this of like, it's just escalating, it's yes. Getting worse, it's getting worse. And to a certain extent, we cringe with these moments of the justice and the judgment and the wrath, so to speak. Yeah. And yet at the same time, when you're reading it, you're almost like, but mercy's not really working. It's just allowing it to keep going. And so there's that tension, even I think, for me, when I'm reading it, of I don't even know what the right thing to do is. Like, mercy's great, but this can't go on.
Yes.
So I think as we've been left with in many books so far, the question then becomes, so what's the plan?
Yeah.
How is God going to resolve this tension?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
How is he going to be just and merciful? How is he going to save us from those consequences and yet still acknowledge those consequences, still deal with those consequences, right? And so we're left with, we've been shown that through all of the muck, Yahweh's been there. He's been working with them. He's been calling them back into relationship with them. He's been warning them.
Yes.
And they didn't listen, and it got worse. And now the consequences came. It had to be answered, but he's not done. We've still had these glimmers that Yahweh's still working. He's still in this narrative.
Yes.
And it's all part of the plan, apparently.
Yeah. He's still with the children of Israel.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's where it's funny. I remember before the Bible study, I thought that I would take too little time, and I'm pushing right up on my head. So, yeah. Well, thank you all for being here and for sticking out with us.
Yes.
Yeah, I appreciate you guys being here. Like I said, I mean, if you guys have questions, you can always, ask me if you see me at church or something. Or if you're on Team 7, you can message me or Jesse. I'm sure even Karina would like to talk about stuff. So
yes. Thank you so much, Ben, for taking the time to, as I mentioned, study and pour into all of us, because I've learned too. And so I'm sure that everyone in the comments, please show some love to Ben and tell him thank you for giving us another wonderful, informative Bible study. We've learned, and again, like Ben says, take the time to dig into scripture, dig into, First and Second Kings, and continue with us as we continue to journey through the Old Testament. Guys, we finished Second Kings. Like, that is amazing. Like, we're getting there. We're not almost there, but we're getting there. So I thank you guys for joining us. And we're not gonna have Bible study next week, but we will have our prayer call, and that's gonna be through Zoom. And join us. So next Tuesday, we just alternate between prayer call and our Bible study. So if you join us next Tuesday through Zoom, and you can go ahead, and the information will be on the bottom. So go ahead and join us. And if you have any prayers, please, we want to pray for you. As well, if you want to sow in to offering into our church, we thank you for partnering with us. If you want to sow a seed, you can go ahead. Below you will see the means of giving, and we just thank you again for partnering with us. Thank you for sowing into the kingdom of God, that we're able to do things like this, where we can reach out to not just within the church, but within Facebook and YouTube. And so please share the link, share with anyone that will be blessed by this. I'm sure, as I mentioned, we're all blessed by it. So we thank you. And we also have Thursday, we have our youth and young adults service, and I'm excited for it. So if you are a young adult, a youth, or you have a youth or young adult, we invite you to come this Thursday at 7:30. Doors open at 7. And again, join us. It's going to be a beautiful time for us encountering God and just seeking the Lord together. So we ask you to join us. And then we're back as well on Sunday. We have our services at 10 a.m. We do have prayer at 7 a.m. to 8 a.m. So if you want to join us before, you're more than welcome to. We start at 7 and we end at 8 o'clock. And if not, we see you at 10 a.m. We also stream it through YouTube. So if you're not able to come, we ask, you could log into YouTube, send the link to someone, invite someone to church. It's been so beautiful. Have we been seeing different speakers come up? Last Sunday, we had Pastor Sarai. She brought such a beautiful word for the fathers, as well for the whole church in general. So we were so blessed by it. So please join us this Sunday. And once again, we just want to thank you, each and every one of you that are joining us, and for anyone that's going to be watching this live later, thank you. And we ask that we pray that you're blessed by this, and that you fall more in love with God and his word, and get to know Yahweh, get to know God, because he loves you. He is for you, and he is with you. So thank you guys. We love you, and have a good night. Bye-bye.
Bye.